February 24, 1986. Van Nuys, California. The sun is setting over Los Angeles, washing the San Fernando Valley in an orange haze. At first glance, it's an ordinary Monday, but for 29-year-old nurse Sherri Rasmussen, the day will end in unimaginable horror. Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're telling Sherri Rasmussen's story with respect and zero graphic images. What you're about to hear is how one tiny piece of evidence changed everything. If you love evidence-driven true crime, you're in the right place. Stay with me to the end. There's a twist most people miss, and it completely reframes the case. Tap subscribe and the bell so you don't miss the next investigation. By 6 p.m., her husband, John Rutan, pushes open the door to their modest condo after a long day at work. He's expecting to see his wife's warm smile, to share dinner, maybe to talk about weekend plans. Instead, he walks into a nightmare. On the living room floor, Sherri is sprawled out, motionless, her body surrounded by blood. Her face is bruised, her clothes torn, and there are unmistakable signs of a struggle. In an instant, John's world collapses. The woman he married just 3 months earlier is gone. When police arrive, they immediately begin circling in on John. His voice trembles as he insists, "If you guys think I'm a suspect, I have a problem with that." What investigators don't realize yet is that Sherri wasn't killed by a random burglar. She wasn't the victim of a stranger. For weeks, someone had been stalking her, lurking in the shadows, consumed by jealousy, and determined to make sure Sherri never got to live the life she dreamed of. And for the next 20 years, this crime will stay buried beneath layers of police missteps, hidden relationships, and a chilling secret inside the Los Angeles Police Department itself. To understand the gravity of this case, you need to know who Sherri was. Born in Loma Linda, California, in 1957, Sherri Rasmussen grew up in a loving, close-knit family. Her father, Nels, and mother, Loretta, encouraged her independence and ambition. Sherri wasn't just bright, she was brilliant. She graduated from college early, at the age of 20, with a degree in nursing. By her late 20s, she had already risen to become the director of nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center. Co-workers described her as the nurse everyone wanted in the room. Compassionate, confident, and calm under pressure. She was the type of woman who could walk into chaos, an emergency room filled with trauma victims, and somehow bring order. But it wasn't just her career that was thriving. In November of 1985, Sherri married the love of her life, 27-year-old John Rutan, a recent UCLA graduate working in engineering. Friends said the two were inseparable, glowing newlyweds who seemed to have it all. What Sherri didn't know was that she had stepped into the middle of a dangerous obsession, an obsession rooted in John's past. Before marrying Sherri, John had been casually dating a woman named Stephanie Lazarus. She was attractive, athletic, and ambitious, but she was also a police officer in the LAPD, someone used to control, authority, and getting her way. The relationship between John and Stephanie never developed into anything serious. According to John, they were never more than friends who occasionally became intimate. Still, to Stephanie, their bond was far more significant. She wasn't ready to let go. When John announced that he was marrying Sherri, Stephanie was furious. Friends recall her showing up uninvited at John's home, acting overly familiar, and refusing to accept that their relationship was over. And soon, Sherri began to notice. In the weeks leading up to her death, she confided in her father, Nels. She told him about a woman who wouldn't leave her alone. A woman who was following her, confronting her, and making her feel unsafe. Sherri was direct. "If anything ever happens to me, look at Stephanie Lazarus." But no one could have imagined how prophetic those words would become. On that fateful Monday morning, Sherri had planned to give a lecture to nursing students. But she never made it. Neighbors later reported hearing screams and strange noises from the condo around mid-morning. One even recalled what sounded like furniture crashing. But in a bustling apartment complex, loud noises weren't unusual. No one called police. When John left for work that morning, Sherri had been in her robe, sipping coffee. Hours later, when he returned home, he found her brutally beaten and shot. The scene was chaos. The condo looked ransacked, as if burglars had forced their way in. A broken vase lay shattered near the door. A stereo system was missing. Jewelry boxes had been rifled through. To detectives, the conclusion seemed straightforward. This was a burglary gone wrong. But there were problems with that theory. Problems staring them in the face. Sherri had defensive wounds, evidence she fought her attacker with everything she had. Her teeth were broken, her lips split open. She had bruises on her arms and legs from being restrained. She had been shot 3 times in the chest, each bullet tearing into her at close range. And the weapon used? A .38 caliber handgun, the exact type commonly carried by police officers. Despite the burglary staging, investigators immediately looked at John. Statistically, the spouse is often the prime suspect. John sat through questioning, devastated. He explained that Sherri was alive when he left for work. He denied having any affairs, denied involvement in her death. But when he failed a polygraph test, suspicion deepened. Detectives whispered among themselves, was this distraught widower actually a killer? John pushed back. If you guys think I'm a suspect, I have a problem with that. What police didn't realize is that they were missing the real danger. During the investigation, Nuys Rasmussen insisted his daughter's death wasn't random. He told detectives about the woman Sherri had feared, a woman who had been stalking her, a woman named Stephanie Lazarus. But to police, it sounded far-fetched. Why would a fellow officer, one of their own, be involved in something like this? Instead, they clung to the burglary theory. They wrote off Nuys's concerns as the ramblings of a grieving father. Evidence that should have been preserved was mishandled. Notes were lost. Key leads were ignored. And as the days turned into weeks, the case went cold. By March of 1986, investigators had all but closed the file. They claimed Sherri had interrupted burglars in her home, that she had been killed in a struggle, and that the intruders had fled. It didn't sit right with Nuys. It didn't sit right with Sherri's co-workers either. None of them believed she was killed by random thieves. But the LAPD had spoken. The official narrative was set. Behind the scenes, though, there was one lingering piece of evidence. Swabs had been collected from Sherri's body, bite marks left on her arm. These swabs were sealed in an envelope and placed into evidence storage. For years, they would sit untouched, gathering dust. What no one realized then was that these tiny swabs would eventually expose a secret so dark, so explosive, it would rock the LAPD to its core. Sherri's murder was about to become one of the most infamous cold cases in Los Angeles history. But in 1986, no one could imagine the twists to come, because the killer wasn't some faceless burglar. The killer was a police officer. And for 2 decades, she would live in plain sight, wearing a badge, carrying a gun, and walking the very halls of the department that had once investigated her crime. The days after Sherri's murder were a blur of grief and unanswered questions. Her parents, Nuys and Loretta, were consumed with shock. Their daughter, who had dedicated her life to saving others, had been taken in the most brutal way imaginable. At Sherri's funeral, mourners whispered about the violence of her death. How could someone so respected, so loved, be targeted like this? To most, the explanation that it was a burglary gone wrong didn't add up. Burglars wanted valuables, not bloodshed. Sherri's death felt personal. Nuys Rasmussen, devastated but determined, couldn't stop replaying his daughter's warnings in his mind. There's this woman, Stephanie. She won't leave me alone. To Nuys, the path forward was clear. Investigators needed to look at Stephanie Lazarus, the ex-girlfriend of Sherri's husband, John. But when Nels raised these concerns, he was dismissed. LAPD detectives told him he was reaching, that he was blinded by grief, that the evidence pointed to burglars, not cops. For Nels, this dismissal would ignite a fight that would consume the next 2 decades of his life. The LAPD's narrative was simple. Sherri must have interrupted burglars who broke into the condo, but the evidence didn't support it. The condo looked ransacked, but it felt staged. Expensive electronics were left behind. The missing items, a VCR and Sherri's car, were hardly the spoils of experienced thieves. Even more troubling, the supposed burglars had shot Sherri with a .38 caliber revolver, a weapon far more common among police officers than criminals. Neighbors heard screams but no sound of multiple intruders running away. And the most damning clue of all, the bite mark on Sherri's arm. It was savage, intimate, the kind of injury inflicted by someone in a frenzy of rage, not a burglar desperate to escape. Still, the LAPD clung to their story. Why? Because entertaining another possibility meant looking inward, at one of their own. Stephanie Lazarus wasn't just any ex-girlfriend. She was a sworn LAPD officer working in the same department tasked with investigating Sherri's murder. At the time of Sherri's death, Lazarus was just 25 years old. Athletic, outgoing, and ambitious, she had joined the LAPD fresh out of UCLA. She thrived on authority, on control. Her relationship with John Rutan had been casual by his account, but to Stephanie it was much more. She believed they had a future. She believed Sherri had stolen that future. In the weeks before the murder, Lazarus showed up at John and Sherri's condo uninvited. She confronted Sherri directly, telling her that if she wanted a relationship with John, she should back off. Sherri confided in her father about these encounters. She was frightened, unsettled. She knew Stephanie wasn't finished. But when Nels raised Lazarus as a suspect, detectives brushed it aside. They argued that a young female officer didn't fit the profile of a cold-blooded killer. They couldn't have been more wrong. By the end of 1986, the Rasmussen case had stalled. No new leads. No suspects. No justice. The bite mark evidence, the single piece that could one day break the case, was boxed up and stored. For years, it would sit in evidence lockers, gathering dust. Sherri's murder became just another cold case in Los Angeles, filed away and forgotten by all but one man, her father Nels. Nels Rasmussen refused to accept the LAPD's version of events. For years, he wrote letters, made phone calls, and begged detectives to reopen the case. Each time, he hit a wall of silence. Detectives told him the case was unsolvable, that evidence had dried up, that his theories about Stephanie Lazarus were baseless. But Nels wasn't wrong, and deep down he knew it. At night, he would sit at his desk, combing through old case files and timelines, convinced that the answer was there. He kept Sherri's memory alive, refusing to let her be reduced to a statistic. His persistence made him a thorn in the LAPD's side. They grew tired of his accusations, his insistence that one of their own was responsible. What Nels didn't know was that, locked away in a manila envelope, the evidence that could prove him right still existed. The 1990s brought advances in forensic science that would change criminal investigations forever. DNA profiling. Suddenly, investigators could match biological samples to suspects with near certainty. Cold cases once thought unsolvable were cracking open across the country. By 1993, the bite mark swab from Sherri's body had been tested. Results showed the DNA came from a woman. This was critical. It meant that the LAPD's burglary theory was even less likely. 2 men breaking into the condo didn't fit. Sherri's attacker was female. And who was the one woman Sherri had feared? Who had confronted her in the weeks before her death? Who carried a .38 caliber revolver as part of her job? Stephanie Lazarus. But again, the lead wasn't pursued. The LAPD filed the DNA result away and moved on. While the Rasmussen family grieved, Stephanie Lazarus thrived. She rose through the ranks of the LAPD, building a career as a respected detective. She worked in internal affairs, even lectured on crime prevention. She married another officer, adopted a child, and lived in the suburbs. On the surface, she was the picture of stability, a devoted wife, mother, and career cop. But beneath that facade was a dark secret. For 2 decades, Lazarus carried her badge and gun, walking the halls of the very department that had ignored her as a suspect. She attended barbecues with fellow officers. She stood in courtrooms, testifying against criminals. And every day, she lived with the knowledge that she had gotten away with murder. By the late 1990s, Nels and Loretta were exhausted. They had spent over a decade fighting for Sherri's case, with no progress. Friends told them to let it go. That closure would never come. But Nels couldn't. He knew too much. He knew his daughter hadn't died in a burglary gone wrong. Each holiday, each birthday, was a painful reminder of what had been stolen from them. Sherri should have been celebrating anniversaries, raising children, living the life she deserved. Instead, she was gone, and her killer was free. In the early 2000s, a new wave of detectives in the LAPD's cold case unit began re-examining old files. The Rasmussen case crossed their desks. One detective, reading through the file, noticed the inconsistencies. The burglary theory that didn't add up. The DNA pointing to a female suspect. Sherri's father's repeated claims about a woman named Stephanie Lazarus. The name Lazarus stuck out. She wasn't just a suspect, she was one of their own. It was a dangerous lead to pursue. Going after Lazarus meant challenging the integrity of the department itself. It meant accusing a fellow officer of murder. But it also meant something else. Finally giving the Rasmussen family the justice they had been denied for decades. The cold case detectives had a choice. Look the other way like so many before them, or follow the evidence wherever it led. And when they did, what they uncovered was more shocking than anyone could have imagined. Because Sherri Rasmussen's killer wasn't just an ex-girlfriend. She was a police officer who had used her badge to hide in plain sight. And the evidence to prove it had been waiting all along. By the mid-2000s, a small team in the LAPD cold case unit pulls Sherri Rasmussen's file from storage. No press release, no chatter in the halls, just a dusty box, a list of contradictions, and one key. A preserved bite mark swab that earlier testing had already indicated came from a woman. The detective leading the review understands 2 things immediately. The burglary gone wrong story never really fit. If the trail points toward a cop, secrecy isn't optional. It's survival. They keep the circle tiny. They don't check evidence in and out like usual. They don't send broadcast emails. They create a need-to-know bubble because there's a name in the file that could blow open trust inside the department. Stephanie Lazarus. They walk the scene again on paper, in photographs, in diagrams. The apartment looks ransacked, but it's the wrong kind of messy. Pulled drawers, visible jewelry left behind, oddly selective items missing. This isn't greed. This is theater. The wounds on Sherri tell a different story. A vicious, sustained struggle. The kind of hand-to-hand fight that ends only when one person can't stand up anymore. A bite mark, intimate and rage-filled, left on her arm. And the shots, close, deliberate, not panicked. If you were staging a burglary, you would break a window, grab the obvious valuables, bolt. What happened here felt like something else. A confrontation, spiraling to lethal violence, hurriedly repackaged as a break-in. Now add the knowns. Sherri had warned her father that a woman, her husband's ex, had appeared at the condo, had confronted her, had not taken the breakup well. Sherri had named her. Not just an ex, but Stephanie. The team pulls Lazarus's personnel file. She's no rookie anymore. She's a seasoned detective who has built credibility and a life. If she did this, she's carried that secret for decades while wearing a badge. The cold case team makes a decision that could define their careers. Follow the evidence no matter where it goes. The preserved saliva from the bite mark is their lighthouse. Unlike memories, like old notes and faded reports, DNA doesn't soften with time. It's binary, match or not. The lab confirms what earlier tests suggested. The profile is female. The circle tightens. But they need something they can compare it to Lazarus's DNA without tipping her off. If she suspects they're onto her, she could lawyer up, she could vanish, or worse, she could lean on connections. So they do it the patient way. Surveillance. A small, quiet detail tracks her routine. Where she works out, where she grabs coffee, where she tosses her trash. You can't compel a suspect's DNA without a process. But you can collect what they discard. A straw, a cup, a napkin. One afternoon, she throws away a to-go cup. A gloved hand lifts it from the bin, seals it, logs it, and rushes it to the lab. Chain of custody airtight. Then the weight. Analysts pull epithelial cells from the rim, build a profile, and line it up against the bite mark DNA. The profile from the bite mark and the DNA from the discarded cup match. If you were watching this in a theater, this is the moment the audience stops breathing. You don't walk into a detective's office and slap cuffs on them without a plan. The cold case team crafts a pretext interview, a conversation framed as a routine consult on an unrelated matter that brings Lazarus into a controlled, recorded room inside the department. They pick a neutral-sounding pretext, one that aligns with her current assignment. A fellow cop asks for her help, a favor even. The implication is collegial. No threats, no warnings. Just, could you stop by? When she arrives, they route her to a small interview room. 2 chairs, a table. The audio and video are already rolling. The detectives are polite, almost casual. They know every word counts. They ease into it. We're looking at an old case and your name came up. Her guard flickers. She laughs off the idea at first. A ghost from the past. They circle closer. It's about Sherri Rasmussen. The air changes. Her eyes search the room for a script that isn't there. She pushes back. Why are we talking about that? What is this? Tries to set boundaries, test the edges. She insists it was ages ago, that she didn't even have much contact, that whatever happened between John and her was ancient history. If she says too much, she's trapped. If she says too little, she looks evasive. The dance is delicate, and the detectives let silence do some of the talking. Then they bring up specifics. Visits to the condo, confrontations, a gun. She says she doesn't recall, offers short answers, shrugs at the gaps. She hints she may need a lawyer and tries to end the conversation. At that exact moment, the trapdoor opens. They step out of the room, come back with brass and bodies. The tone is no longer collegial. It's procedural. She's informed she's being arrested in connection with the 1986 murder of Sherri Rasmussen. Handcuffs click. A badge that once meant authority now signals betrayal. The department moves fast. Search warrants for her home, for her workspace, for any personal storage. The goal: lock down corroboration while momentum is on their side. From her home and belongings, investigators seize journals, photographs, and mementos that, when stacked next to witness statements and lab reports, sketch a motive that is raw and human. Obsession. There are references that align with what friends once described. Intense feelings for John, difficulty letting go, and the emotional turbulence when he chose someone else. They also look for indicators of means and method. Caliber-appropriate ammunition, records of firearm ownership from that era, any logs or reports that might hint at a missing handgun around the time of the murder. Individually, each item is a small tile. Together, they start to form a mosaic. The prosecution's theory crystallizes. A jealous ex, trained in tactics and control, confronted Sherri at home, a fight erupted, and the killer staged the scene as burglary, even moving or stealing a couple of items and driving off in Sherri's car to make it look like thieves had panicked and fled. The irregular ransacking, the intimate bite mark, the close-range shots, and the climber that conquers most defenses, the DNA match from the bite mark to Lazarus. For the LAPD, this is an earthquake. The institution must hold two truths at once: that most officers serve honorably, and that the badge cannot be a shield for the few who don't. The optics are brutal. The original investigation dismissed a grieving father's warnings, clung to a shaky burglary story, and left a killer to thrive inside the House of Justice. Press calls flood in. Reporters chase the dual narrative: the long-ignored ex-girlfriend angle and the cold case team's quiet courage. The Rasmussen family steps in front of cameras in measured doses, never forgetting the person at the center of the headlines. Sherri, a daughter, a wife, a professional who gave her life to caring for others. Retention beat. You can hear it in Nels's voice. This is not triumph. It's an opening of an old wound. The defense strategy is set before the arraignment ink dries. First, attack the evidence. Question the chain of custody. Float the idea of contamination. Suggest that decades in storage could compromise reliability. Try to dull the edge of match with maybe. Second, resurrect the burglary theory. Point back to missing items, a stolen vehicle, and the original detective's conclusions. It looked like a break-in because it was a break-in, they'll say, and nothing more. Third, confront the motive narrative. Challenge the portrayal of Lazarus as obsessed. Suggest that old journal entries are being read through the distorting lens of hindsight, and emphasize that adult relationships are complicated without being criminal. Fourth, humanize the accused. A long-serving officer, career commendations, a family, a life built on public trust. The prosecution sharpens its counter. The DNA is contemporary science, not speculation. The bite mark saliva was collected at autopsy, preserved, tested, and matched. The staging is consistent with intimate partner homicides disguised as burglaries, especially when valuables are curiously untouched. The female profile narrows the field dramatically. Stacking that with motive and proximity makes the coincidence argument thin. The prior confrontations with Sherri are not gossip. Multiple sources reported them at the time, including the victim herself. The training matters. A person versed in evidence and procedure would know how to make a scene look like something it isn't. The day the trial begins, the gallery fills with journalists, true crime followers, cops past and present, and citizens who just want to understand how something like this could happen, and how it could take so long to fix. The prosecution's opening is spare and direct. They avoid theatrics because the facts are the theater. Sherri Rasmussen, 29, newly married, brutally killed in her own home. A bite mark, tested and preserved, ties the attacker to a woman. The ex-girlfriend, a police officer, had motive and opportunity, and had confronted the victim. The scene was staged to mislead. The DNA match to the defendant is not a metaphor. It is a measurement. They promise to show the jury that when you strip away rumor, regret, and time, the science remains. The defense opens with a question, not an assertion. Can you trust a system that failed so profoundly at the start to suddenly be perfect at the end? They speak of missing notes, of evolving standards, of human memory that changes shape after decades. They insist there is still room for doubt, and in a criminal court, doubt is the point. Sherri's colleagues and friends testify to her character. Disciplined, kind, unflappable in crises. They also testify to her fear in those final weeks, fear of a woman who wouldn't let go. It is gutting to hear her warnings echoed in a room where she is the one person who cannot speak. Neighbors recall noises that morning. The thuds, the scuffle. No one heard panicked thieves tearing off with loot. They heard a fight. Crime scene analysts reconstruct the apartment with laser-like clarity. The angles of impact, the trajectories, the pattern that says struggle, not surprise. The burglary inconsistencies are laid out like chess pieces. The jury watches the board change shape. Then the lab experts. They explain how DNA was collected, how it was preserved, and how contamination would show up in their controls. They walk the jury through the matching process without jargon, what a profile is, how it's compared, why the statistics matter. They repeat the sentence that decides many cases. This profile matches the defendant's. The cold case detectives take the stand, describing the covert collection of the discarded cup and the protocols that kept the chain of custody secure. Step by step, they show that this wasn't a fishing expedition. It was a target-driven test prompted by a female DNA profile, prior warnings from the victim, and a pattern that made sense only if someone who knew procedure tried to blot out the truth. Finally, jurors watch excerpts of the pretext interview, stopping, starting, rewinding key moments where the defendant's answers shrink and hedge as the conversation slides from friendly to formal. The room is quiet. Everyone in it recognizes the exact second the ground shifts under her feet. Cross-examinations probe for cracks. Were the evidence lockers ever audited? Who had access? Could clerical errors decades ago create today's certainties? Isn't it possible that missing items point to real burglars, and not staging? They try to give the jury a plausible alternate story. Unknown thieves enter. A confrontation happens. Tragedy follows. They ask jurors to consider how memory corrodes and how gossip accretes, that the ex-girlfriend confrontation may be exaggerated by time and grief. But the female DNA profile sits in the middle of the room like a lighthouse beam you can't look away from. Every alternate path must curve around it, and very few do. Nels and Loretta sit through testimony with the courage that only parents of the murdered can understand. They are not there for spectacle. They are there because their daughter told them to pay attention if anything ever happened to her, and because for 20 years the world wouldn't. John sits in the shadow of the past, living out a sentence too. Survivor's guilt, the public dissection of his old relationships, the suspicion that once hung around his neck like a millstone. You can see the toll in the way he carries himself, in the careful way he speaks when called. The jurors watch all of it. Science and sorrow, procedure and pain. They aren't just weighing facts. They're measuring the distance between what should happen in a just world and what actually did. As the prosecution nears the end of its case, the narrator's line writes itself. For years, the truth sat in a sealed envelope, waiting for someone brave enough to open it. Now the envelope is open, and the truth has a name. We cut to a slow pan of the evidence board, Sherri's photograph, the condo layout, a timeline with pins dotting 1986, 1993, early 2000s, and the arrest. A blown-up image of the DNA electropherogram, a still frame of the interview room. Then we fade to the jurors' faces. Not their identities, not their thoughts, just the weight of what they're being asked to decide. This case isn't only about who killed Sherri Rasmussen. It's about whether institutions can face their own failures, whether evidence can outlast bias, and whether a family's faith in the truth can survive decades of silence. The courtroom empties into hushed hallways. The jurors file into deliberations with binders, exhibits, and the quiet solemnity of people about to sign their names to history. Outside, cameras idle. Reporters trade theories like stock tips. Inside a small anteroom, Nels and Loretta sit shoulder to shoulder, hands intertwined, a posture they've learned over 20 years of vigils. John stares into the middle distance, replaying every moment of 1986. Every what if, every door he didn't know to lock. In the jury room, one item sits at the center of the table. A simple chart that pairs two DNA profiles and a probability so lopsided it feels like gravity. Around it, they've arranged the story's most stubborn facts. The intimate bite, the ransack that read like theater, the .38 caliber, the pretext interview, the discarded cup, the victim's own warnings. They take a first vote not to decide but to map the room. It's not unanimous yet. It rarely is. But the center of mass is clear. They work methodically, testing each doubt against the record, peeling rumor and hindsight off the evidence until only what can stand alone remains. Hours pass. Then a knock. Everyone rises. The defendant stands, face composed, jaw set to granite. The foreperson's voice is steady, almost gentle. On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. Time does not move for a moment. It folds. Nels exhales a breath he doesn't remember holding for 23 years. Loretta's hand trembles in his. John's eyes close, and for once, he is not in an interview room. not answering questions he can't make right. In the gallery, the air is salt and relief and grief all at once. The paradox of justice, where victory and loss arrive in the same breath. The judge dismisses the jury with thanks and a warning. The world outside will have more questions than answers. The court schedules sentencing. The cameras explode outside, but inside, the quiet holds. Guilty is not an ending. It is an address, where accountability lives, and where the rest of us must decide what to do next. On May 11, 2012, the court reconvenes. Impact statements flow like a river finally finding its course. Colleagues from the hospital describe who Sherri was when every second counted, a woman who made chaos obey. Friends resurrect laughter from memory and place it, like a candle, on the record. And then Nels rises. He does not thunder. He testifies to the simplest weight. Waking up every day in a world that forgot his daughter's name for 2 decades, and the vow he made when she warned him. If anything happens, look at Stephanie. He kept that vow. He asks the court to keep its own. The sentence reflects the gravity that the jury recognized. 27 years to life in state prison. The judge speaks to the duplicity, the use of training and badge not to protect but to camouflage. The gavel falls. The paradox repeats. Justice? Too late for birthdays and anniversaries that passed while an envelope gathered dust. Institutions survive by self-correction. They die by denial. The LAPD cannot change 1986, but it can audit it. Reviews follow, some internal, some public. How was the ex-girlfriend's name, given by the victim, sidelined? Why did an early female DNA result not reroute the case immediately? Where did bias, conscious or not, tilt the table toward a story that spared the department embarrassment at the expense of the truth? Most officers wear the badge with honor. That sentence must stand in any honest telling. But for communities to trust, departments must prove that no one is beyond scrutiny. Cold case protocols are revisited. Evidence retention gets new teeth. Cross-unit firewalls are drawn so that cases touching department personnel trigger automatic external review. Training modules shift from how to find a suspect to how to test your own assumptions, emphasizing that the first theory is often the most dangerous one. What we tolerate in the dark becomes our culture in the light. There is something almost holy about preserved evidence. So small you can hold it in 2 fingers, so powerful it can unmake a lie. The bite mark swab was not a smoking gun in a cinematic sense. It was humbler, truer. The science did not demand belief. It invited verification. Compare. Calculate. Repeat. In a story weighted with human failure, the lab bench became a sanctuary. Controls, chain of custody, documented hands, peer review, results that do not care if the truth is convenient. There is a lesson for any cold case unit watching this documentary. Never throw away tomorrow's breakthrough. Evidence collected in the analog era becomes a witness in the digital one. Funding for storage is not a line item. It's a promise. To victims not yet vindicated. To families not yet finished. To a future where past mistakes can still be corrected. True crime often flattens survivors into suspects or footnotes. That's not this story. John Ruetten becomes, in the aftermath, a man allowed to be exactly what he is. Someone who experienced love, loss, suspicion, and the public replay of the worst day of his life. He did not have the words in 1986 to name the danger that hovered over his new marriage. Few would. He had no script for police lights in his living room. He carried rumors he didn't earn, endured questions no one is prepared for, and then lived, somehow, in the ordinary days that followed. In the quiet rooms after the verdict, he is allowed a different memory to lead. The 3 months of marriage before violence authored every chapter. A breakfast, a laugh, a plan for a trip they never took. He will never get those days back. But he can choose which part of the story owns him. Grief is a long road, but purpose is a companion. The Rasmussens become advocates for cold case funding, for evidence preservation, for the simple, radical act of listening to families when they say, "Please check this name." Not every parent is right. But when they are, it's often because victims confide fear where systems file paperwork. They speak at panels and trainings. They tell departments across the country what it felt like to be dismissed and what it took to break through. They teach a principle that does not require a grant or a gadget. Humility is investigative technique. Keeps doors open that pride would slam shut. Let's examine the staging one last time, because it's a blueprint for future investigators. The ransacked drawers that made valuables more visible than they were. The selective theft. The vehicle moved. The broken objects near the entry that felt almost placed. Staging fails in two ways. It either overcommits, too much mess, too neat a chaos, or it forgets the one detail the scene can't absorb, the intimate injury that belongs in only one category, personal. Here, the bite mark functioned like a moral. You can pour sugar in a crime scene's engine, but DNA is the fuel that keeps the truth running. The .38 suggested training. The struggle's length suggested someone comfortable with conflict. The missing items suggested panic, not profit. Each detail was a coin. The purse they filled was motive. Viewers will ask, and you should voice the question for them, how a person sworn to protect could do the opposite, and for so long remain undetected. The answer is not a conspiracy of thousands. It's the simpler, more human mix. Colleagues who couldn't imagine it. Supervisors who didn't want to. A grieving father whose certainty was easier to label as denial. And a culture that, in 1986, didn't have the forensic tools or the internal muscle memory to challenge its own. This is not absolution. It's a map. You fix what you can name. Sherri Rasmussen was not a case number. She was excellence in a white coat, a woman who ran toward the beeping monitor when others froze. Her legacy is not the brutality of her death but the discipline of her life, and the reforms her case pushed into being. Nursing scholarships bear her name. Young clinicians hear her story in ethics seminars about duty and courage. In those rooms, she is not a victim. She is a standard. For families who live inside cold case file numbers, her name carries a second meaning. Keep calling. Somewhere, a small envelope could be waiting with a truth that will finally pick up. Cold case protocols. Mandatory female/male profile flagging triggers expanded suspect sets. No lazy assumptions. Internal walling. When a case tangles with department personnel, outside oversight engages by default. Evidence preservation. Statutes for long-term storage get funding and audits. Training. Curriculum includes cognitive bias, confirmation traps, and staged scene diagnostics. Family liaison. A dedicated, consistent point of contact to prevent the black hole effect families described for decades. Justice is a staircase, not a switch. You climb it one correction at a time. Cut to the hallway outside the courtroom the day of the verdict. The press has thinned. The fluorescent hum is all that's left. The camera tracks behind Nels as he pauses at a window, the kind you can't open. Light washes the corridor like an absolution no one ordered but everyone needed. For 23 years, the truth sat in a sealed envelope. Not gone, waiting. What opened it was not luck. It was a father who would not sit down, a science that would not lie, and a handful of detectives who remembered the oath before the optics. We fade to black on Sherri's photo, not the crime scene, her graduation smile, a stethoscope around her neck, eyes fixed on a future that deserved more pages. If you made it this far, thank you for honoring Sherri's story with your time. Cases like this remind us that justice isn't fast, but it can still be true. If you want more investigations that go beyond headlines and into the evidence, tap subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss what we uncover next. Up next, I'm covering another case where one overlooked clue broke everything open. Click the video on your screen. You'll see how a single fiber sample exposed a serial offender hiding in plain sight. I'll meet you there.